The hammer fell at 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and with it, everything Sarah Mitchell had left of her father disappeared into someone else's hands. The auctioneer's voice echoed across the courthouse steps as strangers picked through her family's farm equipment like vultures over a carcass. Tractors her grandfather had maintained, tools her father had used to work land that had been Mitchell ground for 4 generations. All of it gone to pay debts she hadn't known existed until the lawyers arrived 3 weeks after the funeral. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, her 7-year-old daughter Emma clutching her hand, watching numbers climb on items that held no value to anyone but her. The John Deere that had taught her to drive went for $1,800 to a dealer from 2 counties over. Her father's toolbox, the one with his initials carved into the lid, sold for $45 to a man who would probably throw out the photographs tucked inside without looking at them. By noon, the only thing left was the farmhouse itself, sitting on 12 acres of Tennessee soil that the bank had somehow missed in their calculations, probably because the structure was worthless. 2 stories of peeling paint, sagging porches, and a foundation that had been settling unevenly since before Sarah was born. The house wasn't on the auction block today. The bank had other plans for it, demolition most likely, once they finalized the foreclosure paperwork. Sarah had 30 days to remove anything she wanted to keep before the bulldozers arrived. 30 days to strip her childhood home of memories and leave the bones to be crushed into landfill material. She'd been living in Knoxville for the past 9 years, working as a project coordinator for a construction company that had laid her off 6 months ago. The severance had run out in October. Her apartment lease was up in 2 weeks, and her landlord had made it clear he wouldn't be renewing it, given her employment situation. She had Emma to think about, school registration coming up, and exactly $3,000 in savings that wouldn't cover first and last month's rent anywhere decent. The farmhouse sat empty and dying 40 minutes outside the city, full of ghosts and structural problems, but legally hers for another month. The decision made itself somewhere between watching her father's workbench sell for $30 and realizing she had nowhere else to go. They moved in on a Saturday in late April, when the dogwoods were blooming white against the dark tree line and the fields beyond the property boundary had started showing the first green tips of whatever crop the neighboring farmer had planted this year. The moving truck was a rented pickup that held everything Sarah and Emma owned: boxes of clothes, a few pieces of furniture, Emma's books and toys, and the weight of failure that Sarah carried in her chest like a stone. The house looked worse up close than it had from the courthouse steps. The front porch listed to one side, boards soft with rot in places where rain had gotten past the deteriorating roof. The white paint had given up years ago, peeling away in long strips that revealed bare wood, weathered grey beneath. Windows on the 2nd floor were cracked, and one was missing entirely, covered with a sheet of plywood that Sarah's father must have nailed up during one of his increasingly rare maintenance efforts in the final years before his death. Inside smelled like dust and time and the particular staleness of a house that hadn't been properly lived in for over a decade. Her father had spent his last years occupying only the downstairs, sleeping in what had once been the dining room because the stairs had become too difficult for him to manage. The rest of the house had been allowed to fade into disuse, rooms full of furniture draped in sheets and closets stuffed with belongings that nobody had wanted badly enough to claim after the funeral. "Mom, it smells weird," Emma said, her voice small in the empty front hall. The girl had been quiet since the eviction notice, understanding more than Sarah wanted her to about their situation. 7 years old and already learning that the world didn't guarantee stability or fairness. "We'll air it out," Sarah replied, propping open the front door and moving through the downstairs to unlock windows that protested with decades of accumulated paint. "It just needs some fresh air and cleaning. You'll see." The kitchen was a museum of Sarah's childhood. The same avocado green appliances from the 70s, the same Formica countertops with the burn mark near the stove where her mother had set a hot pan down without thinking. The same table where Sarah had done homework while her mother prepared dinner, and her father came in from the fields, smelling like diesel and earth and hard work. Her mother had died when Sarah was 16. Cancer that had started quietly and moved fast, taking her in the space between Christmas and planting season. Her father had never really recovered. He'd kept the farm running for another decade, but the life had gone out of him with her mother. The house had started dying with her, room by room, until only the kitchen and the makeshift bedroom remained occupied. Sarah spent the first week cleaning. She scrubbed floors and washed windows and hauled trash bags full of ruined clothing and molded paperwork out to the burn pile behind the barn. Emma helped where she could, wiping down baseboards and sorting through boxes of old toys that had belonged to Sarah when she was young. The house began to smell less like abandonment and more like the lemon cleaner Sarah bought in bulk from the dollar store. The real problems revealed themselves slowly. The plumbing worked, but only barely, groaning and knocking in the walls when Sarah ran water. The electrical system was a disaster of old wiring and outlets that sparked when she plugged anything in. The roof leaked in at least 4 places she'd found so far, staining ceilings with brown water damage that would require more than buckets to fix properly. But the structure was sound. The foundation, despite its uneven settling, wasn't cracked. The walls were solid, built from timber that had been harvested from the property itself back when her great-grandfather first claimed this land. The bones were good, even if everything else was failing. Sarah had construction knowledge from her 9 years coordinating projects. She understood load-bearing walls and structural integrity and the difference between cosmetic damage and serious problems. She could fix most of what was wrong with this house if she had time and materials. What she didn't have was money for either. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The basement was the last place she explored. She'd been avoiding it, remembering childhood fears of the dark space beneath the house where her father had stored canning supplies and her mother's preserves. The wooden stairs creaked under her weight as she descended with a flashlight, Emma staying upstairs because even 7-year-olds had enough sense to be wary of dark basements in old houses. The space was surprisingly dry. Concrete floor, stone foundation walls that showed the craftsmanship of builders who'd understood how to work with Tennessee clay and seasonal flooding. Shelves lined the walls, mostly empty now, except for a few jars of preserves so old the contents had turned black. A workbench stood against the far wall, covered in tools her father must have used for projects he'd never mentioned. It was while examining the foundation, checking for cracks or water damage, that Sarah noticed something odd about the wall near the northeast corner. The stonework didn't match. It was the same material, the same general construction style, but the pattern was interrupted. Where the rest of the foundation showed stones laid in regular courses, this section had been rebuilt, recently, relatively speaking. Within the last 50 years, rather than the 100-plus years that marked the original construction. Sarah ran her hand over the stones, feeling the difference in the mortar. Newer cement, rather than the lime-based mixture used in the original work. The section was roughly 5 feet wide and extended from floor to ceiling. Someone had taken out part of the original foundation and rebuilt it, then tried to make it match well enough that casual observation wouldn't notice the repair. Her father's work, probably. He'd done odd repairs over the years, maintaining the house with whatever materials and knowledge he had available. This looked like his style of fixing things, thorough enough to be functional but not quite polished enough to be invisible. Sarah was about to dismiss it as just another example of her father's maintenance efforts when the flashlight beam caught something else. A gap in the mortar, barely visible, running vertically along one edge of the repaired section. Not a crack, but a deliberate line, like a seam. She pressed against the stones, testing. Most were solid, set firmly in the mortar, but near the bottom, Where the vertical seam met the floor, one stone shifted slightly under pressure. Sarah knelt, examining it more closely. The stone was loose, deliberately left that way. She worked it free, feeling it slide out with the kind of ease that suggested regular movement. Behind the stone was darkness and a rush of air that smelled like earth and old metal. Sarah aimed the flashlight into the gap, seeing nothing but void. Her heart was beating faster now, construction knowledge telling her this wasn't a repair at all. This was an access point. Her father hadn't fixed a damaged foundation. He'd built a door. She removed 3 more stones, working carefully, setting each aside in the order she'd extracted them. The opening grew larger, revealing more of whatever space existed behind the false wall. The smell of metal grew stronger, mixed with something else. Paper, old and musty, like archives or storage. When the opening was large enough, Sarah aimed the flashlight through and saw what her father had hidden behind a century-old foundation wall in a farmhouse that the bank considered worthless. Metal cases, military grade, from the look of them, stamped with numbers and codes that meant nothing to Sarah but suggested official origins. Stacked floor to ceiling in a space that extended back into darkness beyond the reach of her flashlight beam. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, filling what appeared to be a room as large as the basement itself. Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled her phone from her pocket, turning on its flashlight for additional illumination. The cases were old, painted green that had faded to grey in places, marked with stencils that looked military. She could make out partial words on the nearest ones. Property of U.S. Army. Confidential. Do not open. Her father had been a farmer, third-generation Tennessee dirt farmer who'd served 2 years in the Army in the late 60s, come home, married her mother, and spent the next 40 years working land that barely supported his family. He'd never mentioned military connections beyond his basic service, never talked about anything classified or confidential, never gave any indication that the foundation of his house concealed enough government property to fill a warehouse. Sarah reached through the opening, fingers brushing the nearest case. The metal was cold, solid, real. This wasn't some fantasy or misunderstanding. Her father had hidden something substantial behind a wall he'd rebuilt specifically to conceal it, something important enough to seal away, something he'd never told anyone about, not even his daughter. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made Sarah pull back from the opening, heart hammering. Emma appeared at the bottom of the steps, looking around the basement with wide eyes. "Mom, what are you doing down here?" Sarah glanced at the hole in the wall, at the metal cases visible through the opening, at the decision point she'd just reached without meaning to. She could seal this back up, pretend she'd never found it, leave it for whoever demolished the house to discover, or she could open one of those cases and find out what her father had considered important enough to hide for however many years he'd kept this secret. "Just checking the foundation," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "Making sure it's safe. Why don't you head back upstairs?" "I'll be done here in a minute." Emma nodded, lingering at the stairs. "Are we going to be okay here, Mom? In this house?" The question carried more weight than a 7-year-old should have to bear. Sarah looked at her daughter, at the worry in her young face, at the trust that said she believed her mother would somehow make everything work out, despite all evidence to the contrary. "Yeah, baby," Sarah said. "We're going to be okay." Emma headed back upstairs, footsteps fading above Sarah's head. Alone again, Sarah turned back to the opening in the wall, to the metal cases and the secrets her father had kept. She reached for the nearest case, fingers finding the latches that held it closed. The metal was cold against her palms as she pulled the case through the opening, setting it on the basement floor where the flashlight illuminated it fully. The stenciling was clearer now. Property of U.S. Army, Chemical Corps, confidential. A serial number that meant nothing to Sarah but suggested tracking and accountability. The latches opened with surprising ease, as if they'd been maintained, kept functional despite their age. Sarah lifted the lid, revealing contents that would bring military officials to her door within 48 hours and transform her quiet desperation into something infinitely more complicated and dangerous than simple poverty and foreclosure. Inside the case, arranged in precise rows, were documents, photographs, technical drawings, all marked with classification stamps and warnings about unauthorized disclosure. And beneath those, in sealed containers that looked designed to preserve their contents indefinitely, were samples, vials of substances Sarah couldn't identify, labeled with codes and chemical formulas that exceeded her understanding, but screamed danger in their very precision. Her father hadn't hidden family heirlooms or valuable antiques behind that wall. He'd concealed evidence, proof of something that people with power and resources would desperately want to remain buried. Something that Sarah Mitchell, broke single mother with nowhere else to go and 30 days before demolition, had just dragged into the light of a basement that smelled like dust and secrets and choices that couldn't be unmade. Sarah sat back on the concrete floor, case open before her, understanding that whatever she did next would determine not just whether she and Emma survived their current crisis, but whether they survived at all. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with documents spread across the same Formica surface where she'd once done algebra homework, trying to make sense of what her father had hidden and why. The photographs were black and white, dated 1968 through 1971, showing soldiers in protective gear handling equipment she didn't recognize. The locations weren't identified, but the terrain looked wrong for Vietnam. Too flat, too empty. Desert, maybe. Somewhere in the American Southwest, based on the scrub vegetation visible in some shots. The technical documents were beyond her understanding. Chemical formulas, exposure protocols, decontamination procedures. Words like organophosphate and cholinesterase inhibitor that sounded medical but carried warnings that suggested weaponry. One document, stamped with red letters reading IS only, detailed something called Field Trial Shepherd, a testing program conducted between 1969 and 1972 at an installation the document identified only as Site 7. Her father's name appeared in 3 places. Private First Class Daniel Mitchell, assigned to the 42nd Chemical Detachment, listed among personnel present during trials conducted in August 1970. His signature appeared on a non-disclosure agreement dated the 12th of September 1970, promising silence about activities observed during his service. And most damning, his name was handwritten on a separate page, part of a list labeled Exposure Event. Participants with dates and symptoms noted beside each name. Daniel Mitchell, the 14th of August 1970. Acute respiratory distress, vision impairment, severe tremors. Hospitalized 8 days. Released to duty September 1. Sarah read that line 6 times, trying to reconcile the man she'd known with this evidence of suffering he'd never mentioned. Her father had been healthy for most of her childhood, strong enough to work the farm and handle the physical demands of rural life. But she remembered his later years, the tremors in his hands that he'd blamed on old age, the breathing problems that had worsened until he'd needed an oxygen tank beside his bed, the headaches he'd suffered in silence, refusing to see doctors because he claimed they never helped. She'd thought it was just the natural decline of a man who'd worked hard his whole life. Now she was looking at evidence that his body had been failing since 1970, deteriorating from exposure to substances the government had tested on its own soldiers. The vials in the metal case represented samples, evidence that her father had somehow obtained and preserved, documentation of what had been used during those field trials. Sarah had no idea if the contents were still dangerous after 50-plus years of storage, but the warning labels suggested they weren't something that should be sitting in a basement where a 7-year-old child slept 2 floors above. She'd sealed the case after her initial examination, returned it to the hidden room, and replaced the stones in the wall. Emma didn't need to know what lived behind that foundation. Nobody did. until Sarah figured out what her father had intended by preserving this evidence and why he'd never acted on it himself. The answer to that last question arrived in a letter she found tucked in the back of one of the cases, written in her father's careful handwriting on paper that had yellowed with age. "To whoever finds this," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone and my silence has ended. I kept these materials as insurance and as testimony to what was done to men who trusted their government to protect them. We were told the trials were safe, that we were testing defensive equipment against simulated threats. We were not told that the simulations used actual chemical agents or that the protective gear we tested was deliberately inadequate to measure exposure effects. 17 men participated in the August 1970 trials. By 1985, 12 of them were dead. Cancer, respiratory failure, neurological disorders. The Army denied any connection to our service. The VA refused disability claims, citing lack of evidence linking our conditions to military exposure. We were scattered across the country, dying alone, unable to prove what had been done to us. I took these materials in 1971 during the decommissioning of Site 7. Others were destroyed, burned, or buried in desert graves that will never be found. I kept them thinking I would use them someday to force accountability. But I was a farmer with no legal knowledge and no resources to fight institutions that could outlast any individual effort. I was scared of what they might do to my family if I spoke up. I was tired from being sick and from watching friends die while bureaucrats denied our suffering. So I stayed quiet. I built a wall and hid the evidence and told myself that someday, when I was stronger or braver or less afraid, I would act. That day never came. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry to the men who died believing their sacrifice meant nothing. I'm sorry to my daughter, if she's the one reading this, for leaving her this burden. If you have the courage I lacked, make them acknowledge what they did. Make them answer for the lives they destroyed. The evidence is here. The truth is documented. All it needs is someone brave enough to speak it. The letter wasn't signed, but Sarah recognized the slant of her father's handwriting, the careful formation of letters by a man who'd left school after 8th grade but had taught himself to write with precision. She folded the paper carefully, hands steadier than she expected, understanding now why the wall had existed and why her father had never torn it down. He'd been protecting his family, protecting Sarah and her mother from retaliation by people who'd already proven they were willing to sacrifice soldiers' lives and then deny responsibility. He'd chosen silence and safety over justice and truth, and he'd lived with that choice until it killed him. Sarah looked around the kitchen, at the house that was falling apart, at the life she was trying to build from the wreckage of her father's legacy. She had 30 days before demolition, $3,000 in savings, a daughter who deserved stability and safety, and a basement full of evidence that could either provide justice for dead soldiers or paint a target on her back from people who'd spent 50 years covering up what they'd done. The smart choice was obvious. Seal the wall, say nothing, let the demolition crew destroy whatever they found without understanding its significance. Take Emma somewhere safe and build a life that didn't include government secrets and classified documents. Her father had chosen that path. She could honor his decision by making the same choice. But Emma's question from the basement kept echoing in her mind. Are we going to be okay here, Mom? What kind of okay was built on silence about men who'd been poisoned by their own government? What kind of safety came from hiding evidence that might prevent the same thing from happening to other soldiers in other trials that were probably still happening somewhere? Sarah made coffee as the sun rose over the fields beyond the property line, turning the sky pink and gold above land that had belonged to her family for 4 generations. Her father had worked this soil his whole life, damaged lungs, pulling in air thick with pollen and dust, trembling hands gripping tools that grew heavier as his strength faded. He died in a house he could barely maintain, surrounded by equipment being sold to pay debts he'd accumulated because the VA had denied his claims for exposure-related disabilities. The smart choice felt like betrayal, not just of her father, but of the other men who died without acknowledgement. The 17 participants in Field Trial Shepherd who'd trusted their government and paid for that trust with their lives. Sarah was still wrestling with the decision when the phone rang at 8:30 that morning. Unknown number, area code she didn't recognize. She answered because employment opportunities sometimes came from unfamiliar numbers, and she still needed income despite their current living situation. "Miss Mitchell." The voice was male, professional, with the kind of neutral tone that suggested practice at delivering information without emotion. "This is Colonel James Reeves, United States Army Chemical Corps. I need to speak with you about property recently acquired from your father's estate." Sarah's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "How did you get this number?" "Miss Mitchell, I understand this call may seem unusual, but I assure you it's important. We have reason to believe your father may have retained materials that remain classified government property. I'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss the recovery of those materials and compensation for any inconvenience." The politeness was calculated, professional courtesy masking something harder underneath. Sarah set down her coffee, mind racing through implications and responses. She'd opened the cases less than 12 hours ago. Even if her father had been under surveillance, which seemed paranoid but not impossible, there was no way military officials could know about her discovery this quickly, unless they'd been watching the house, waiting for someone to move in and start exploring, waiting for exactly this moment when curiosity would overcome caution and hidden things would be brought into the light. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear climbing her spine. "My father was a farmer. He didn't have government property. Miss Mitchell, I'm not here to create problems for you. Your father served honorably, and we simply want to recover materials that should have been returned upon his discharge. If you cooperate, we can handle this quietly and compensatively. If you choose not to cooperate, things become more complicated for everyone involved." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah thought about Emma sleeping upstairs, about the basement full of evidence, about her father's letter explaining why he'd chosen silence. She could feel the weight of that choice pressing down on her shoulders, the same burden her father had carried for 50 years. "I need time to think about this," she said. "Of course. I'll be in Tennessee tomorrow. Perhaps we could meet at your property? Say, 2 o'clock. He had her address. He knew where she lived, knew she'd inherited the farmhouse, probably knew about the foreclosure and the eviction and every desperate detail that had brought her here. This wasn't a random call. It was a carefully planned approach by people who'd done their research and understood exactly how vulnerable she was. "Fine," Sarah said, 2 o'clock. She ended the call and sat staring at her phone, understanding that she'd just run out of time for careful deliberation. The decision was being forced on her by people who'd been covering up Field Trial Shepherd for 5 decades and weren't about to let a broke single mother threaten their secrecy. Sarah spent the rest of the morning taking photographs. Every case, every document, every vile and technical drawing and piece of evidence her father had preserved. She used her phone, uploading everything to cloud storage as she worked, creating a record that would survive even if the physical evidence disappeared. Her construction background had taught her the importance of documentation. You couldn't prove what you couldn't show, and verbal claims meant nothing against institutional denial. By noon, she had over 300 photographs, organized and backed up to multiple accounts. She printed the most important documents on her father's ancient printer, making physical copies that she sealed in waterproof bags and hid throughout the house. Evidence scattered and preserved, harder to destroy completely, even if they confiscated the original cases. Emma came downstairs around 1, having slept late after their exhausting week of cleaning and settling in. "Mum, why are you printing so much stuff?" "Just organizing some of Grandpa's old papers," Sarah said, keeping her tone light. "Boring adult stuff. You hungry?" We could make sandwiches. They ate lunch together at the kitchen table, Emma chattering about a book she was reading, while Sarah tried to focus on anything except the meeting scheduled for 2 o'clock. She hadn't told Emma about the phone call or the hidden room. 7 years old was too young to understand government conspiracies and chemical weapons testing, too young to carry the weight of secrets that had already cost too many lives. At 1:30, a black SUV pulled into the driveway, followed by a second identical vehicle. Sarah watched from the window as men in civilian clothing emerged, 3 from each vehicle. They moved with military precision, scanning the property and establishing positions that suggested training and purpose beyond a simple recovery mission. Colonel Reeves was the last to exit, distinguishable by his age and the way the others deferred to his authority. He was probably 60, grey-haired and trim, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that looked deliberately casual. Trying to appear non-threatening despite arriving with 5 other men to intimidate a single mother living in a house that could barely be called habitable. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, stepping onto the porch to keep them outside, where Emma wouldn't overhear. "Colonel Reeves, Miss Mitchell, thank you for agreeing to meet." His smile was practiced, the kind of expression that probably worked on people who didn't recognize manipulation when they saw it. "I hope we can resolve this quickly and amicably." "Resolve what? Exactly? You still haven't explained what you think my father had." Reeves glanced at his men, then back to Sarah with an expression that suggested patience wearing thin. "Miss Mitchell, let's not waste time with denials. Your father served in a specialized unit that handled sensitive materials. Some of those materials were not properly accounted for during his discharge. We need to recover them before they pose a danger to you or your daughter." The mention of Emma was deliberate, a reminder that they knew about her child and could use that knowledge however they chose. Sarah felt anger cutting through her fear, hot and sharp in her chest. "If these materials are so dangerous, why didn't you recover them while my father was alive? He lived in this house for 40 years. You could have asked him any time. We respected his privacy and his service. We're only here now because the property is changing hands, and we're concerned about safety during renovation. Surely you understand our position." Sarah understood perfectly. They'd left her father alone because he'd stayed quiet, accepting their denial of his disability claims rather than fighting back with evidence. Now that he was dead and the property was in flux, they were moving to recover materials before someone less compliant took control. "And if I cooperate? What exactly are you offering?" Reeves pulled a folded envelope from his pocket, extending it toward her. $50,000 for any materials you might locate, plus assistance with your current financial difficulties. We understand you're facing foreclosure. We could help with that. Clear the debts, provide resources for necessary repairs. All we need is your cooperation and your continued discretion. $50,000. Enough to save the house, create stability, give Emma the security Sarah had been desperate to provide. All she had to do was hand over evidence of crimes committed against American soldiers and stay silent about what she'd found. Sarah took the envelope but didn't open it. "I need to think about this." "Of course. But Miss Mitchell, I need to be clear about something." Reeves' tone shifted, losing the veneer of friendliness. "These materials remain classified government property. Unauthorized possession is a federal crime. Disclosure of classified information carries serious penalties. We're offering you a way to resolve this situation that benefits everyone involved. I'd hate to see you make choices that would force us to pursue legal action." There it was, the threat beneath the courtesy. Cooperate and profit, or resist and face prosecution. They had the law on their side, the resources to bury her in legal fees and criminal charges, the power to take Emma away if they decided Sarah was an unfit parent harboring dangerous materials. Her father had faced the same choice. Speak up and risk everything, or stay silent and protect his family. He'd chosen silence, and it had killed him slowly over decades of denied medical care and accumulated suffering. Sarah looked at Colonel Reeves, at the men positioned around her property like an occupation force, at the envelope containing money that would solve all her immediate problems. Then she thought about 17 men who'd trusted their government and died without acknowledgement, about her father's letter apologizing for his cowardice, about Emma growing up in a world where injustice was tolerated because fighting it was too expensive and too dangerous. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," Sarah said. "Same time." Reeves' expression hardened slightly. "Miss Mitchell, I don't think you understand the urgency of this situation." "I understand perfectly, Colonel. You want materials that my father kept for 50 years without incident. One more day won't make them any more dangerous than they've been for the last 5 decades. She could see him calculating, weighing the benefits of pressing harder against the risks of alienating her completely. Finally, he nodded, stepping back from the porch. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. I hope you make the right decision." The SUVs pulled away, leaving dust hanging in the spring air, and Sarah standing on a porch that sagged under her weight. She watched until they disappeared down the road, then went inside to find Emma reading in the living room, apparently oblivious to the confrontation that had just occurred. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Sarah returned to the basement. She removed the stones again, pulling out the case containing her father's letter and the most damning evidence of what had been done during Field Trial Shepherd. She sat on the concrete floor, documents spread around her, making the choice her father had been too afraid to make. She called the number for the Tennessee office of her congressional representative, leaving a message that she had evidence of illegal chemical weapons testing on American soldiers and needed to speak with someone about federal whistleblower protections. She sent encrypted emails to 3 journalists who specialized in military accountability, attaching selected photographs and offering to provide full documentation in exchange for protection and publication. She recorded a video on her phone, explaining everything she'd found and why she was coming forward, uploading it to a private account with instructions for Emma to release it if anything happened to Sarah. Insurance against the kind of accidents that military whistleblowers sometimes experienced. By midnight, she'd set in motion a process that couldn't be stopped or recalled. The evidence was distributed, the story was being told, and Colonel Reeves' offer of quiet cooperation was no longer possible. Sarah sealed the wall one last time and climbed the basement stairs to a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old memories. She'd made her choice. Now she had to live with it, whatever consequences followed. Her phone rang at 6 the next morning. Colonel Reeves, calling 3 hours before their scheduled meeting. Sarah answered, already knowing what he would say. "Miss Mitchell, I'm disappointed. I thought we had an understanding about discretion. We had a conversation about cooperation. I decided I prefer transparency." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Sarah wondered if he'd ended the call. Then Reeves spoke again, voice colder than before. "You have no idea what you've just done. The people you've contacted can't protect you from consequences you don't understand. I'm giving you one final opportunity to reconsider before this situation becomes irreversible." "It's already irreversible, Colonel. The evidence is public. The story is being told. You can't put it back in the basement." "We'll see about that." The call ended. Sarah set down her phone and watched the sun rise over her father's land, knowing that she'd just declared war on institutions that had been winning this fight for 5 decades. But she'd also done what her father had died, wishing he'd been brave enough to attempt. She'd spoken the truth. Now she'd find out what that cost. The journalists arrived first, 3 days after Sarah's phone call. They came in a rental sedan, not the intimidating SUVs that Colonel Reeves had deployed, and they knocked politely, rather than positioning themselves like an invasion force. Sarah met them on the porch while Emma played in the backyard, her daughter's laughter drifting through the spring air like evidence that normal life could still exist alongside government conspiracies and classified secrets. Rachel Torres was from the Washington Chronicle, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a recording device she set carefully on the kitchen table. She'd been covering military accountability stories for 15 years, she explained, and had seen enough patterns of denial and suppression to recognize authenticity when she encountered it. The photographs Sarah had sent were compelling. The documents were damning. If Sarah was willing to go on record, Torres could guarantee the story would reach audiences that mattered. "I need to know you understand the risks," Torres said, her voice carrying the weight of experience watching whistleblowers destroyed by institutions with unlimited resources and no accountability. "Once this story publishes, you become a target. They'll investigate every aspect of your life. They'll question your credibility, your motives, your fitness as a parent. They'll make you regret speaking up in ways you can't imagine right now." Sarah poured coffee into mismatched mugs salvaged from her father's cabinets, thinking about the eviction notice that had brought her here, the auction that had stripped away her father's belongings, the decades of denied disability claims that had killed him slowly while bureaucrats shrugged. They already took everything that mattered. What else can they do? "More than you think," Torres replied. But she smiled slightly, recognizing the determination of someone who'd already made peace with consequences. "All right, let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your father." Sarah talked for 3 hours, describing Daniel Mitchell's life in details she hadn't thought about in years. The way he'd taught her to drive a tractor when she was 12, letting her steer while he worked the implements. The careful precision with which he'd maintained equipment, even when his hands shook so badly he could barely hold tools. The oxygen tank beside his bed in those final years, hissing steadily while he insisted he was fine, just tired from a life of hard work. She showed Torres the basement, the hidden room. The cases arranged like a shrine to men who died without acknowledgement. The reporter photographed everything, her camera flash illuminating shadows that had existed undisturbed for half a century. She handled the documents with respect, reading through exposure reports and medical denials with an expression that suggested professional outrage barely contained beneath journalistic objectivity. "Your father wasn't just keeping evidence," Torres said. Studying the timeline Daniel Mitchell had constructed, showing how 17 healthy young men had deteriorated into premature deaths over 15 years. He was building a case. He knew exactly what this represented and what it could prove if anyone had the courage to use it. "He didn't have that courage," Sarah said quietly. "He chose his family over justice. He chose to keep his daughter safe. That's not cowardice, Miss Mitchell. That's love in a world that punishes people for doing the right thing." The story published 4 days later, front page of the Chronicle's Sunday edition with photographs of the documents and Sarah's testimony about what her father had hidden and why. Field trial Shepherd exposed. Classified testing program killed 17 soldiers. Government denied responsibility for decades. The headline was stark, the evidence was documented, and the public response was immediate and overwhelming. Congressional representatives demanded investigations. Veterans groups called for accountability. Social media exploded with outrage about soldiers being used as test subjects and then abandoned when they developed the predicted health problems. Within 48 hours, 3 more veterans from the 42nd Chemical Detachment came forward with their own stories of exposure and denial. Men Sarah's father had served with, who'd spent decades believing they were alone in their suffering. Colonel Reeves called again, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "You've made a serious mistake, Miss Mitchell. Publishing classified materials is a federal crime. You'll be hearing from Justice Department prosecutors very soon." "I'm sure I will," Sarah replied, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. "I've already retained legal counsel specializing in whistleblower protections. They're looking forward to the discovery process, particularly the documents you'll be required to produce about field trial Shepherd." The call ended without further threats. Reeves understood what Sarah had taken time to learn from the attorneys who'd contacted her after the story published. Prosecuting her would require acknowledging that the documents were authentic which would validate everything her father had preserved and everything the army had spent 50 years denying. The government's best option was to negotiate quietly, offer compensation to surviving participants and families, and hope the story faded from public attention before anyone started asking how many other field trial shepherds existed. The bank withdrew its foreclosure proceedings 3 weeks after the story broke, not from compassion or recognition of Sarah's circumstances, but because the farmhouse had become famous. Demolishing a property at the center of a national scandal would generate exactly the kind of publicity that financial institutions preferred to avoid. They offered Sarah a loan modification that actually made the payments manageable, restructuring her father's debt into terms that acknowledged reality rather than optimistic projections about farm income that had never materialized. Money arrived from unexpected sources. Veterans organizations contributed to a fund for field trial shepherd families. Private donations came from people moved by the story of a single mother fighting government institutions that had destroyed her father. A publisher offered an advance for a book about Daniel Mitchell's life and the evidence he'd preserved. Not enough to make Sarah wealthy, but sufficient to repair the farmhouse roof, replace the dangerous electrical wiring, and create stability for Emma that didn't depend on constant crisis management. Sarah hired local contractors for work beyond her capabilities, but she handled most of the restoration herself, stripping old paint, replacing rotted boards, patching the plaster walls that had cracked during decades of neglect. The work was physical and exhausting, and exactly what she needed. Each repair felt like honoring her father's memory, maintaining the house he'd kept standing despite the illness destroying him from inside. Emma helped where she could, holding tools and asking questions about Grandpa Dan's life. Sarah answered carefully, editing the truth into versions appropriate for a 7-year-old understanding. Your grandfather was very brave. He helped other soldiers who were hurt. He kept important secrets to protect people he loved. Simple truths that captured the complexity without requiring Emma to carry burdens too heavy for childhood. The congressional investigation proceeded with the glacial slowness of government accountability. Hearings were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. Documents were requested, redacted, challenged in court. Surviving Chemical Corps officers testified with carefully rehearsed denials and failures of institutional memory. The pattern was familiar from previous military scandals. Delay everything, admit nothing, wait for public attention to shift elsewhere. But the families of field trial shepherd participants refused to be patient or quiet. They organized, hiring attorneys who specialized in mass tort litigation against government defendants. They shared medical records and service documents, building a case that connected 17 deaths to a single testing program that had violated every ethical standard regarding informed consent and duty of care to personnel. Sarah became the public face of their advocacy, not because she wanted attention, but because her father's evidence made denial impossible. She testified at congressional hearings, describing how Daniel Mitchell had deteriorated from a healthy young soldier into a man who couldn't breathe without mechanical assistance. She appeared on news programs, holding photographs of her father before and after his exposure, visual evidence that bypassed bureaucratic double-talk and connected with audiences who understood suffering when they saw it. The work was exhausting and emotionally devastating. Every interview required Sarah to revisit her father's death, to describe in clinical detail how he'd struggled for breath in those final weeks, how the tremors had made it impossible for him to feed himself, how he'd apologized through the oxygen mask for being a burden. But the testimony mattered. Each time she spoke, another family came forward with their own story of denied claims and premature deaths. The pattern became undeniable even to institutions built on denial. Summer arrived in waves of heat that turned the fields beyond the property boundary, golden with wheat, ready for harvest. Sarah watched the neighboring farmer work his land with equipment that cost more than most houses, massive combines that processed acres in hours. Her father had farmed with a tractor from the 60s and implements held together with welding and determination. The comparison illustrated everything about how agriculture had changed, how small operations like the Mitchell farm had been rendered obsolete by industrial efficiency and economy of scale. But Sarah wasn't trying to resurrect her father's farming operation. She was building something different here, a home for herself and Emma, a memorial to 17 men who'd served their country and been killed by that service. A testament to the power of one person's courage to challenge institutions that seemed immune to accountability. The basement room stayed sealed most days, but Sarah visited occasionally, standing among the metal cases and remembering the night she'd opened that first container and discovered her father's secret. The evidence had been moved to secure storage as part of the legal proceedings, but she'd kept copies of everything, documentation of what had been done and how long it had been hidden. Proof that silence could kill as surely as chemical exposure. Emma started school in the fall, attending the same county elementary that Sarah had gone to 30 years earlier. The building was newer now, rebuilt after a fire in the 90s, but the bus route was identical. Sarah stood at the end of their driveway, watching the yellow bus disappear down the road, feeling the weight of continuity and change. Her daughter was growing up in the same community Sarah had known, walking the same red clay soil, breathing air that smelled like crop dust and distant rain. But Emma's future would be different. The settlement money from the government's quiet resolution of field trial shepherd claims had established a trust fund for participants' children and grandchildren. Not enormous wealth, but sufficient for college tuition and opportunities that Sarah's generation hadn't been able to afford. Emma would inherit her grandfather's determination without having to sacrifice her health or her future to institutional indifference. Rachel Torres won a journalism award for her coverage of Field Trial Shepherd, recognition that came with speaking invitations and job offers from larger publications. She visited the farmhouse in October, bringing champagne to celebrate the legal settlement that had finally acknowledged what Daniel Mitchell and 16 other men had suffered. They sat on the front porch in the cooling evening air, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and violet. The porch didn't list anymore. Sarah had rebuilt the foundation and replaced the rotted boards, creating a structure that would last another century if properly maintained. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished," Torres said, raising her glass in a toast to absent heroes and delayed justice. Sarah thought about that. Pride seemed inadequate for what her father might feel, knowing that his silence had been broken and his evidence had forced accountability from institutions built to avoid it. Relief, maybe. Vindication. The bitter satisfaction of being proven right, even though the proof came too late to save him. He would be grateful, Sarah replied, that someone finally told the truth he was too afraid to speak. The settlement negotiations had revealed details about Field Trial Shepherd that made the original documents seem restrained. The program hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a broader testing initiative that had exposed thousands of soldiers to chemical and biological agents between 1952 and 1975. Most of the records had been destroyed during the Church Committee investigations in the 70s. Daniel Mitchell's preserved evidence was among the most complete documentation that survived, which explained why Colonel Reeves and his superiors had been so desperate to recover it. The Army eventually admitted limited liability, offering compensation to verified participants and their families without acknowledging broader institutional responsibility. The amount was calculated to resolve claims without creating precedent for other testing programs that probably existed in archives nobody wanted opened. Sarah accepted the settlement because fighting for complete admission would take decades and cost more than any monetary judgment would recover. Emma would receive approximately $300,000 when she turned 18, administered through a trust that would fund education and provide living expenses during college. The other families received similar amounts, compensation that felt simultaneously inadequate and miraculous, depending on how you measured the value of stolen health and abbreviated lives. Sarah used her portion to finish restoring the farmhouse and to establish a small non-profit dedicated to helping military families navigate the VA disability claims process. The organization was named the Daniel Mitchell Advocacy Center, operating from a converted bedroom upstairs, where Sarah spent hours helping veterans file paperwork and challenge denials. The work was frustrating and often unsuccessful, but occasionally she helped someone get benefits approved or medical care authorized. Small victories against a system designed to outlast individual persistence. Winter came early that year, snow falling in November and accumulating in drifts that transformed the property into landscape paintings of white silence. Sarah taught Emma to build snow forts, the same way her father had taught her, showing the girl how to pack snow into blocks and stack them into defensive walls. They worked together in the cold air, breath clouding around them, creating temporary architecture that would melt with the next warm spell. Emma asked questions sometimes about the things that had happened, trying to understand why strangers had visited their house and why Mum had been on television talking about Grandpa. Sarah answered honestly but gently, explaining that sometimes people in power do wrong things and hide them, and that speaking truth about those wrongs was important, even when it was difficult and scary. "Were you scared?" Emma asked one evening, while they made dinner together in the kitchen that smelled like onions and possibility. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "But being scared doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing. Sometimes the right thing is the scariest thing, and you do it anyway because staying silent would be worse." Emma absorbed this with the seriousness of children who sensed they were being told something important. "I want to be brave like you and Grandpa when I grow up." Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathing in the apple scent of her shampoo and the particular sweetness of childhood that wouldn't last much longer. "You already are, baby. You've been braver than you know." The first anniversary of Sarah's discovery passed quietly in spring, marked only by fresh flowers placed on her father's grave in the county cemetery. Daniel Mitchell was buried beside Sarah's mother under a simple headstone that listed his dates and his service. Sarah added a new marker, smaller but permanent, inscribed with words she'd chosen carefully. He kept the truth when speaking it was dangerous. He protected the innocent when institutions failed them. He chose love over justice, then gave others the tools to choose both. The words weren't perfect, couldn't capture the complexity of a man who'd lived 50 years with evidence of crimes and the burden of silence. But they acknowledged what he'd done and why, creating a record that would outlast the people who remembered him. Representatives from veterans organizations attended the unveiling, along with 3 surviving members of the 42nd Chemical Detachment who'd traveled to Tennessee to honor a man who'd preserved evidence that finally brought them acknowledgement. They stood together in the cemetery while Sarah read her father's letter aloud, the apology he'd written to whoever found his hidden truth. "He thought he was a coward," one of the veterans said afterward, an elderly man whose hands trembled with the same palsy that had marked Daniel Mitchell's final years. "But he gave us what we needed to prove what happened to us." That took more courage than he credited himself for. Sarah returned to the farmhouse feeling like something had been completed, a circle closed or a debt settled. The house was warm when she entered. Emma, already home from school and working on homework, at the kitchen table where 3 generations of Mitchells had lived their daily lives. The normalcy felt earned, paid for in testimony and sleepless nights, and the courage to speak when silence would have been safer. The basement room remained sealed, its contents removed, but its existence permanent. Sarah sometimes stood at the top of the basement stairs, remembering the night she'd discovered what her father had hidden and the choice she'd made about what to do with that discovery. She'd gambled everything on the belief that truth mattered more than safety, that justice delayed was still worth pursuing, that ordinary people could challenge powerful institutions and occasionally win. The gamble had paid off, not with wealth or fame, but with something more valuable. knowledge that 17 men and their families had finally received acknowledgement. Proof that silence could be broken and secrets could be exposed, even when institutions built themselves on darkness and denial. Evidence that one person's courage could matter when directed at the right target with sufficient determination. Sarah stood on the rebuilt porch one evening in late spring, watching the sun set over her father's land, while Emma played in the yard with a confidence that spoke to security and stability. The farmhouse stood solid behind her, restored to functionality if not beauty, serving as both home and monument to everything that had happened here. The soil beneath her feet held memories of 4 generations who'd worked this land and built their lives from its reluctant yields. Her great-grandfather clearing trees and planting first crops. Her grandfather surviving the Depression through determination and resourcefulness. Her father maintaining traditions while his body slowly failed from poisons administered by the government he'd served. And now Sarah and Emma, writing new chapters in a story that had nearly ended with foreclosure and demolition. The land endured, the truth endured, and families like the Mitchells endured, generation after generation, finding the courage to stand against forces that seemed overwhelming until someone finally stood up and forced them to answer for what they'd done. Sarah watched the last light fade from the sky, turning the fields to shadow and the house behind her to silhouette. Somewhere in the darkness, her father's legacy persisted, not in the evidence he'd hidden or the justice his silence had delayed, but in the lesson he'd taught through both his choices and his regrets. That speaking truth was worth the cost. That protecting family didn't require surrendering principles. That ordinary courage, applied at the right moment with sufficient conviction, could change systems built to resist all change. Emma called from inside, asking if Mom wanted to watch a movie before bedtime. Sarah turned toward the house, toward the warm light spilling from windows she'd repaired with her own hands, toward the future she'd built from the wreckage of her father's past. "Coming, baby," she called back, and she walked into the house that had sheltered secrets and suffering and finally, miraculously, had become simply home.